a troubling pattern has emerged during the pandemic, bringing rise to a larger, longer, more systemic issue of anti-Asian racism. The violence is unsettling. 856 Canadian incidents since COVID began. Asian Canadians are being assigned blame for bringing the virus to Canada and told to, quote, go back home, having slurs spewed at them, and elders are being beaten in the streets. Two of our experts on Cityline join us today with their experiences. Welcome, Pei and Trevor, as well as Amy Go, the president of the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice. Now, Amy, I always like to start at the beginning. I like to start at the governmental level and talk a little bit about history and some of the ways the government has contributed to the racism that Asians have experienced in this country.
Definitely. As soon as Chinese came to Canada in the 1800s, we were met with racist laws. Large number of Chinese laborers were brought into Canada to build the most dangerous part of our Canadian railway to unite the country. So after the railway was built, almost immediately, our president of government, said that these machines had to be returned. So in 1885, they imposed a head tax starting at $50. It went up to 1903 for $500. $500 in those days, you could buy 2 houses in Toronto. But all these actually failed from the perspective of the government. So in 1923, they imposed the Exclusion Act, banning all Chinese from Canada on July 1st. So July 1st became humiliation day for Chinese communities. And these are not just the only legislations. There are many others banning Chinese from conducting specific businesses, from entering professions, from, of course, exercising the rights, and including Chinese men could not marry white women. So you could be put to jail for falling in love. So these are just some examples in our early days. And of course, as you said, these legislative discrimination, unfortunately, continue to have an impact on us today.
And this is what we mean when we say systemic injustices are baked into the system. So the country is built by people from outside of the country, and then when they try to become part of the country, they are told, no, you've done your job, go back home. Very important to get the context so that we know where the racism is rooted. And also, Canadians, we're always patting ourselves on the back. Let's not be so quick to pride ourselves on our multicultural society, because we have work to do here. So, Pei, I'm going to go to you now. You post a lot about anti-Asian racism on your social media feeds in the hopes of educating people. One thing you're very vocal about is the assumptions that people make because you are Chinese. So talk to me about what you've encountered.
It's things that you've experienced your whole life. And I've been very lucky. I've not experienced any violence. I've not experienced a crazy outburst where someone has, physically harmed me or tried to harm me. But there are little things that go out through your entire life that at some point as you get older, you think, wait a minute, this doesn't happen to everyone. I mean, I grew up in Nova Scotia where we didn't have a large Asian community. Then when I moved to Toronto, some things are a little bit different. And that's when I noticed there was a little change in people's perception of me. But even in a multicultural city like Toronto, I'll get questions like, where are you from? And often I'll say, Nova Scotia. And no, where are you really from? Because the assumption is, well, I'm Asian. I couldn't possibly be from here. I must be a foreigner. Now, it doesn't mean that there's like hatred behind that question, but when you're asked that constantly, you do feel othered. It's like, people don't think I'm from here. I must be from somewhere else. I've had people say to me when I said I grew up here, they'll say, well, you don't even have a Chinese accent. Why would anyone who grew up in Canada have a Chinese accent? So there's those assumptions. There's assumptions of things like, well, you must be good at math. And a lot of those violent attacks against Asian Canadians and Asian Americans, only a small percentage get reported. And I think that's something we have to acknowledge, because culturally, we don't raise our voices. We don't say anything. We don't complain. And there's a real fear of speaking up. And there's a language barrier for some as well. So there's a lot of little things that when you say something to someone who is Asian, think for a second about why you made that assumption. Like, I've been told in every city I've ever been in that I look just like someone that they went to high school with. Did I? Or were they Asian?
Yeah, and what you're what you're speaking about, a lot of things. You talked about the model minority situation, but also microaggressions. And so, Trevor, I want to get you in on this conversation, and you can talk about either or, like talk about microaggressions you have experienced, or maybe feeling like very kind of trapped by this whole idea of the model minority.
Tracy, it's very, very similarly to what Pei says. These are things that we've experienced our entire lives. I can remember my experiences either in schoolyards or on the playing fields when I played organized basketball and soccer. People were surprised that I could actually shoot a basketball or jump or run fast because Asians are not supposed to be athletic. And so that carried on even in my corporate life. I can't even tell you the amount of times people had asked me whether I knew martial arts or kung fu, because I'm assuming because I'm Asian, but it wasn't. I don't think you go up to anyone on the street and ask them if they know kung fu or martial arts, or the commentary on if I can actually see properly through these eyes. I mean, these things are so normalized within and ingrained in society culturally that we don't speak up enough about it. You know, in the food business, we get it all the time. The dichotomy and the discussion around things like MSG. And there are studies behind the article that was written in the 60s about MSG and how it was fabricated compared to the scientific facts of what MSG is, because the main core ingredient inside MSG is something called glutamate that's actually naturally created in all our bodies. And it's in things like green tea, breast milk, tomatoes, Parmesan cheese. So we talk about that. And also, like, being a restaurant owner myself, I kind of almost feel like we have to work extra hard to depict that our restaurant is clean, because how many times have we heard the commentaries? If I can show you some of the reviews about, oh, I wonder if the food is clean, I wonder where their food is from, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of times what this is, it's normalized conversations. And as a model minority, people assume that we'll just put our head down and it'll just bounce off of us. But listen, you hear it long enough, you hear it enough times, it almost becomes normalized for us. But now, with the onset of the pandemic, as well as the violence against seniors, we need to really take a look at all this historically and change the systemic sort of language around everything that we're used to.
Language is power, and we've said this before. If we don't start changing that, it's very difficult to change these assumptions that people have gotten so normal, like they've gotten so normalized, as you said. So, Amy, what do folks need to know when it comes to assumptions?
So all these perceptions need to be checked. So I would call upon everybody to think about whenever you encounter an Asian Canadian, whenever you are reading about news about Asian Canadians, when you're in the workplace or wherever, to understand all those impacts of all those assumptions and perceptions and stereotypes, and how each one of us should start to reflect on our privileges, on our position in the society, and how we can exercise our rights and our responsibilities to correct these assumptions, as well as to challenge systemic racism, to challenge the inequities in our system, in our laws, and everything.
Amy, Trevor, and Pei, thank you for sharing your lived experiences and also for the education. I appreciate it. We appreciate it so much.